So, this is a demo class. In this demo, we will see exactly whatever the topics that we have covered in the last two modules related to AWT programming. And in this demonstration, we will discuss about few things, right. So, how the applets can, how the different GUI elements can be included in a container, in a components, and the different containers also like say frame, panel, and the different components, GUI components like button, checkbox, label, list, choice, scroll bar, menu item and everything, and also how the layout can be managed by the use of layout managers that is there in AWT, and finally, we will also see exactly an application point of view how these kind of things will be useful to develop our application. So, this is the overall what is the agenda for this demonstration. Now, let us have the first program. How in this demonstration you will be able to see how we can create a frame, and then the same frame can be added and then the frame can be executed, and we will just discuss about non-applet versus applet program. I will just discuss about the non-applet program right now. So, here basically we want to create a frame and the same frame can be displayed on a screen. So, this is the program as we see here. So, this is the program as we see here. In the first lines as you see, we just here the class basically we define this class is basically my frame, the name of the class as is shown, and then the main, it is a basically application. So, we have used the main method here, and in this main method we create a class. Okay, in this method we can see we create a frame here, and then this frame is basically we pass to an argument as a string, the frame in Java. That means, as you know, frame is a container with a title. So, it is basically in the title bar it will appear this one, and this is the size. We have to resize the frame, that how size it will be there, and background that we have discussed here. The color of the frame will appear with the blue background, and then finally, the frame dot show indicates that frame will be visible. Now, so if you run this program using Java interpreter, and then you will be able to see the output that it will show it to us here. So, this is basically the frame. Now, I am just going to little bit doing the changes here in the main program here in the resize method, just 500 that we have given it. Now, let us change it to 300 versus 500. Now, we will see the size of the frame will be changed automatically. Yeah. So, we can see that size of the frame has been changed, it is like this. So, if you change it, then size of the frame will be changed again 100 versus 500, then you can understand how the size is affected, because it is a very minor change. So, very small changes in the pixel. Now, you have to save the program class. Why it is not giving the different sizes? You have changed the size, save and then compile it. You are not compiling, right. Yeah, as you change the size, and we have just seen that how the size has been changed. So, accordingly we can, for example, if we say the if we change say 600 versus 100, then you can see how the changes will be there. So, that is just for you can test of your own, also you can see it how the different sizes of the frame can be created and the same can be displayed it. Yeah. So, this is why it is 600 100. 600 100 600 100 600 versus 100, if you give it, then it is okay, fine. 600 is not good. So, 600 versus 100, listen to me then. Yeah, exactly, it is like this. So, you can understand that if you change the size parameter, it will change this one. Now, so this is about how we can create a frame. And now, our next demonstration related to the creation of a panel. Just like the frame creation will be panel, frame and panel basically the two things are mostly same, except that the panel does not have any title bar. And here we can see we first create a frame and we include one panel inside the frame. So, this is the basically method as you see, first statement create a frame, and then frame having the title say frame with panel, and then next we create the panel with the only constructor it has there, no string to be passed here like the frame, and then resize frame and then resize panel, everything we are doing here. And then if we run this program, and here you can see we have not mentioned that the location of the panel where it should be. So, by default it will go to the left and then topmost corner actually, and however we can place the here we can see the panel, the color background has been chosen as yellow, and then background of the frame is blue, and we can change it. If we change any one parameter, accordingly the things will come into the change effect. So, this is about creating panel and then frame. Now, let us have a very simple example from the components. As you know, there are many components that is possible in Java AWT. We will just give a discussion about the button. So, button, how a button can be created, and then how this button can be resized, and then the same button can be added. Now, in this example, as we see, we first create a frame, and then frame, inside this frame we are planning to create one button. We create a button B as the button, and having the label on this button as click me, and then we decide the set bounds. It is basically first two values indicate that x and y location, and then the next two values indicate width and height of the button. If we change any one value, our button will be changed, and then size is basically set size is basically give the size of the frame actually, because it is related to the frame only. And then set layout, it is basically null, you have to make it there, we are not using any null layout manager. So, that is why null, and then f dot set value is true, that visible actually, that means the whole the things, the container containing a button will be displayed to us. Now, so let us run this program, I will be able to see the output here. As you see this one, there are many more things also can be done. A button can be with different color, different context and everything. For this, the different constructor that we have discussed in the button class can be used for this purpose. Now, set bounds, as we see, the size of the button can be controlled here. So, as we have mentioned, the last two buttons are regarding the width and height. If I change it to 50 and 60 like, so it is basically change of the button size will be changed automatically. Say maybe yes. Now, let us see. We have changed the button size is there. Yes, now we are save it. Okay, so compilation is done, and then we are running it. Yeah, as you see here, the button is created. Compared to the previous example, as you see, size has been control there, and you know the size of the button also, if you use a layout manager, that can be also controlled by h gap and v gap. That is another example we will discuss while we will give a demo of the layout manager. Now, let us have the next demonstration on the checkbox. So, how the checkbox can be created? As you know, the checkbox basically contains a number of items to be added there, and then it will has the checkbox check window actually, where the check can be either ticked or without unticked, that is basically check or uncheck can be there. Now, here the creating the checkbox as similar to the button actually. In that case, we should take the help of checkbox class. So, using the checkbox class, we have created a checkbox 1 button here, and then title is basically C++. Then another checkbox also we have created like Java, and then we just add this checkbox into the frame. So, f dot add checkbox 1 and f dot add checkbox 2, it basically says that checkbox 1 and checkbox 2 is added into the frame, and the rest of the thing is same as regarding the configuration of the frame. Now, here you can see for the checkbox 2, we make the second parameter as true, whereas for the checkbox 1 we did not mention any second parameter, by default it is false. So, the true means this checkbox will appear with a tick mark like. So, now if we see the output of this program, this is basically a frame based, not an applet based. So, we can see exactly here. So, the two checkbox C++ and Java, where the second checkbox is ticked, that means it is true, checkbox is true. Now, if we click the mouse there and there, you can see the tick button will be changed there. So, but here in this case we ticked it, but there is no event generated, because we have not used any event handling mechanism here in this particular example. Whenever we add some event handling concept, then it will basically do if we check this one. Our next example, checkbox group. It is similar to the checkbox itself, but is a group of items can be added together here. Now, here you can see we create a checkbox group with 3 items, 2 items, one is okay fine. So, create the checkbox 1 and checkbox 2, add these 2 checkboxes into the checkbox group. So, this is basically the procedure, and we have done it, and we add finally all the checkbox group into the frame. So, here this is basically we adding the checkbox group into the frame. So, it overs, and then if we run it, then we can see the checkbox group how it will look like. Yeah. So, as you see here, and so it is just similar to the checkbox actually, but it is a group this one, and little bit difference as you see here. In case of simple checkbox, the check window appears is basically square, but here is a color is a round shape circle type, and it is the difference between the checkbox and then checkbox group. Now, we will see exactly how the label can be included in a container in a frame. Suppose here we create a first frame, and then here we can see in this example we create a label. The two labels are created, L 1 and L 2, and the two labels are labeled as first label and then second label, and then we just position the label into certain location which is mentioned here, including its sides, and then second label also, and finally we add the two labels L 1 and L 2 into the frame, and frame is configured, and as you see the it will basically gives an output containing two labels on the frame. As you see here, the first label and the second label, as it is the name of the label here, two labels are displayed on the container. So, this way right. Now, whatever the example that we have considered in a particular program, we can include all these things. That means, your container can contains many components, although here in every example we are using the different components to be included into the frame. Our next example, text field. Now, how a text field can be created, this example will tell us, and then within the text field something can be written also if you write it, and then that component will be sensed by the event generator, event handler, and event handler will do the output accordingly. Anyway, so event handling is now skipped here in this example. Simply we will see exactly how a text field can be added into a frame. So, for this we just write an application program here, first create a frame, and then we create a text for two text fields are created, T 1 and T 2 are there. So, T 1 is basically text field with initial default what is called the labels are there, welcome to IIT, and then the set bounds is always there, in which location this text field will be floated, and then what is the size of the text field. As you can change the location, automatically different positions it will float, and then size also accordingly can be changed. And then again second is the second is also used with the different level NPTEL Java tutorial like, and then set bounds also decided the same as the first T 1, and then finally we add T 1 and T 2 into the frame, and then frame is reconfigured, and then that is all. This is about the creating text field in our program. Now, we can run this program, and as we see here, yes. So, this is there, and you can move the mouse pointer into any text field, and if we mouse it here, and you can type anything. So, there is a type, whatever you can type, it is there, and then this type will go, and then we can include it there. So, this way the text field is basically allow a user to type something from the user using keyboard, positioning the mouse pointing first there, and all this is the user there. Actual use will be discussed shortly in the different illustration that we will discuss. Now, like text field, there is another one example, it is called the text area. Now, text like text field, the text area is there, but text field has the limited number of characters that it can accommodate, whereas text area is basically is a sufficient area of the things or can be accommodated here. So, as you know, if you want to include one para like say, then you should consider the text area instead of text field actually, and so it basically okay, give a display a good volume of strings actually. Now, here is the example, as we see here, we create a frame first, and within this frame we create a text area A, and then we just okay, this text area include a default text like welcome to IIT KGP, and then that size of the text area is decided here, set bounds is there. That means, this is the amount of string characters that you can include into this area, and then finally, we add this text area into the frame, and then frame is configured, and then frame is visible as true. So, that we can see the output. As you see here, these are default text. We can write as much text as it is possible, total within the text area it is shown there. And one more thing that you can note is that the text area, whenever you define okay, and then text field, the difference between the text field and text area is that text field is smaller in size, of course, whereas text area is larger in size. But there is one more difference that you probably noticed it, there in both sides the two scroll bar area is coming. So, if you go on typing much more text and everything, so using the scroll bar area you can scroll the entire area of the text area, that is possible to have it there. So, scroll bar automatically it is coming into your text area. So, usually text area is always accompanied with both scroll bar horizontal and as well as vertical. We do not have to explicitly prepare it to be added, although scroll bar can be added independently other than this one also. So, this is a very good example of text area, and it has many application in the context of many application sense actually. Our next example is basically showing exactly list. List is okay. So, list of items that can be included and those can be processed. So, here basically an Windows program, people many times use the list, and then from the list one item can be selected. It is like this is basically objective, and here we can see there are two types actually, list and choice item. This example is basically list. We create L1 we create one list is called the LL, and we just create also a frame because we want to include this list in a frame, and then obviously the list is size of the list is specified by the set bounds method, and then L1 is added into the list. Okay, so in the L1 list we add few items here, as you can see. If we go on adding, it will just add into the items, like in this example as you see 3 items has been added, namely item 1, item 2 and item 3, although we have discussed the list of size 5, that means 2 are remain vacant actually. So, even if we do not do it also it is there. However, if we go for adding more than 5 actually, so only it will consider up to maximum 5 and the rest of the things will be automatically discarded. And then finally, we add this list into the frame and frame is size. So, now we will see here this example includes a list of 5 items. Presently, it contains only 2 items in it, and it shows this one. As you see here, if we select any one item, as you will see, it will basically showing the selection. So, automatically it is done within a very simple code. You can see how many things that we can do it. Now, we will see alternative to list items also. There is another variations of this list is called the choice. So, choice is similar to the list, but the difference you can see if we run the example here. First, let us see the example. Okay, run this one choice. Yeah, we can see exactly what is the difference from the list and choice. Here you can see the choice basically list shows all the items which basically it has, whereas choice will not show it, but if we there is a small scrolling, if we click it, all the items which are there inside the choices will be included here, and if we select any one, that will be highlighted into the choice item. So, if we like that. Okay. So, this is the idea, it is very similar to, but it is more elegant in case of choice than the list, and probably you have faced many application where you can see this kind of examples in your example. Now, our next example is scroll bar. We have already shown that using text area how the scroll bar can be automatically coming into there, but the scroll bar can be used in a different way. Let us see exactly how the scroll bar can be created and it can be included in our frame. So, first we create a frame, and then we create a scroll bar. For this the class scroll bar is to be used. So, scroll bar S is the name of the scroll bar in this case, and new scroll bar, and here we have scroll bar object. For this we created some values are there horizontal, that means this is a horizontal scroll bar, and then is basically starting and then location actually in which location it should come here, and then finally it basically visibility how much portion of the things scroll bar will be visible, and finally it is a range from which value to which value it is there. All those values is basically not explicitly to be there, but whenever scroll bar is negotiated, then the value automatically can be handled by the event handler actually, as we have not discussed the event handler. So, this part will be skipped here anyway, later on, and then finally, the size of the scroll bar can be decided is a set bounds, and it can be added, and then it can be added into the frame. Now, like horizontal scroll bar, another vertical scroll bar also we have created, and the same vertical scroll bar is added into the frame, and the two scroll bar. So, this example includes two scroll bars, one is horizontal and vertical. Now, let us see the output of this program, so you can understand exactly how this thing it is working. Yeah. So, here you can see the two scroll bar, the first one is horizontal and second one is vertical. Now, so if you design one graphical user interface, then accordingly you can position these two scroll bar where you want to do it, and then finally you can use it, and if you can move it using your mouse drag, then you can move it, and if you can release the mouse drag at a particular position, it basically says that in which location of the mouse drag is basically stopped it there. Location is basically what is the range that you have mentioned according to the range, and then again size of the scroll bar, you can see the scroll bar window actually, those are basically dark one. Yeah, this is the size, and the size is basically you can decide also very smaller size, larger size depending on your program. So, you can customize it like anything. So, this is the scroll bar example, and so far all the examples that we have discussed, there no applet is involved, and this is basically the frame. Now, we just discuss about one example where all these things will be utilized. I am discussing about a simple example where a graphical user interface can be created, by which user can enter the two what is called the name and then ID of the students, and then it can be used, and then finally it can be stored in a file or like this one. So, this example we are creating using an applet. So, here if we want to create a GUI using an applet, so basically we have to create an applet. So, this is the applet class extends applet, and here the event handling in action listener we can skip it right now. Now, here you can see in this example we create one text field, okay, we create three text field rather 1, 2 and result like this, and also we create 4 buttons, namely add, sharp, mal and deep. Now, let us run this applet, then we can understand exactly what we are going to do it. Now, I am giving you the view of this applet first, and then I will explain the program, so that you can understand. Okay. So, here yeah. So, now I will keep it little bit bigger in size please. Yeah. So, now let us keep this not so much big size. Yeah. Okay, fine. Now, so this is basically the applet as we see. So, here we can see two text fields which basically shown here. These two text fields also, to understand that which is the text field. So, two labels also we have mentioned here, three levels actually, three text field, three levels. The first level is basically first number, and the second level is second number, and third level is result. And as you see, for the first number there is a text field, and then for the second number is called another text field, and another is the result is another text field. And so, these are the two text fields, three text fields are created, and then labels also there. Now, in the next example as we see, here. So, label L1 is created, that is the first, and then it basically label dot right means right alignment actually. So, the second level and then third level. So, three labels are created, and then also we have defined text fields like say 1, 2, 3 results, and then button also add, sharp, mal and deep, and then for this 1, 2, 3 these are the text field that we have instantiated here, and this is basically size of the text field area. As you see, this is basically the size, and so this is basically the, and then finally we add 4 buttons, the label as add, then sharp, mal and deep, and we add these buttons. So we define 4 buttons here, and finally we see we add all these elements. So, add labels, 3 labels like, and also we add text fields. So, this is the add. Now, here we are adding it, and but adding you see in flowing some order, because we do not have mentioned explicitly where they will be added here. By default they will be follow certain default what is called the layout management. So, in this case actually they are the default layout management. So, this completes the look of the applet that will be there, and rest of the parts is basically related to the action handling. Now, again go to the applet again that we have already created there. If we type something, go there, in the first one say 25, and then next is say 15, and then the result if we see, so the result, so okay, add, maybe add, so the result will be automatic. Now, this basically here the event is generated, and corresponding event some result is computed, and then it will displayed. So, this is the next part of the program is related to this one. Now, here you can see how an applet can be planned or can be designed, so that it can include the components it is there. Our next example is the same thing, but not using applet, but using frame. So, here again the same, but using frame little bit bigger in size, right. So, that you can understand it. Yeah. So, this you can see here the example is similar to the previous example only, and here we create the 3 text fields, namely number, name and marks, and then button, enter and done. So, 2 buttons are created, and then 3 text fields it is created, but you see it is not an applet. It is rather a component container window we can say, and that window is created in this program. As you see, it is basically we create a frame actually. So, this is a frame based right, and so we create a frame. In this frame we create 3 text fields, then 2 buttons, and they are added into the frame, and then finally frame is resized, and rest of the things is related to the event handling. Now, here if we type something here, so that type, right. So, first name, and then second name, and then done, or enter. Enter means it will go there, and then again clean it. So, this means one record is entered. Next we can do it like say ABC, right, and then done. Done means it is complete, and then the application will close it. Yeah. Okay. So, okay, fine. So, this is basically an example, and obviously it is the idea is that how a frame can be designed, and then how it can be handled and everything. That is the most important idea to discuss in this demonstration. Now, we will discuss about the layout management. As you have learned in the theory class, there are 4 different type of layout: the flow layout, grid layout, border layout and card layout. And so, there are 4 examples that we can discuss here. We can give a demonstration for the 4 layout management scheme actually. Let us have the demonstration on the flow layout management. As you know, flow layout management by default will arrange all the components that you can add into a frame like here, and they can be added from left to right in that sequence only, the sequence you have mentioned here in your program. So, here we have added say B1 to B10 10 different buttons, and then that buttons are labeled as 1, 2, 3 like, and then we have added one frame, and those buttons are added into the frame. In that sense actually it will go into the layout manager. Layout manager will place them from left to right, that means button 1 first, then button 2 and so on till the size of the frame occupy them actually. Then the next row it will come, and the next row, then alignment may be from left to right. In this example we can by default is the right alignment, and then something also can be done in a left also. Here actually if you see set layout new flow layout, this is the way that layout manager can be invoked. In earlier example we have not mentioned this one. So, default is the flow layout manager, but here we are explicitly mentioning that we want to use the layout manager as a flow layout, and this is basically left aligned. Now, let us run this program and we will change the alignment at the left or right, something like sometimes there is center alignment is also possible here. Okay, as we see here, so left. Now, if we change is right like you will see exactly how different the output will occur for you. Now, here if you see alignment is basically in the same order, but alignment is basically from right. If the size is changed, as is very small size, whatever the portion it is possible to include, it can be shown here, but if the size is changed, then automatically they can adjust automatically into the total area. So, in that sense it is basically a little bit fluidic, that means it can maintain it, but is a left to right or right to right, that is the only thing it is you can see it. So, this is about the flow layout manager. Alternative to flow layout is a border layout. Here actually the total area canvas we can say can be divided into 5 regions: center, left, right, and then north and south like. So, this is the convention of the layout specification according to the border layout. Again we create here 5 what is called the components, 5 buttons actually. Here they are labeled as north, south, east, west, center and like this one, and then we just adding them into the frame, and following the layout manager is called the border layout. So, it is basically we have to mention that in which location which particular component will go. So, border layout dot north, basically we are adding button B1 into that region, it is like this. Now, okay, if we run it, we can we can mention it there as we see here. So, here 4 components, mainly the 5 components, 5 buttons have been there, and you see the size of the button. In the earlier examples where we have to mention the size of the button explicitly by using set bounds, but we have not mentioned here. By default whatever the area that is will be there, this is a basically default size is there. However, size also can be controlled either using set bounds or using the h gap and v gap of the this one. So, here for example, add B1 border layout north, then h gap in pixel and v gap in pixel also can be considered. So, that is a gap between 2 neighboring either top or bottom or sides components, the size gap can be automatically mentioned, and accordingly the size will be fixed there. So, this is about the border layout, and the next is basically the grid layout. As grid layout, basically border layout has only limitation that only 5 components can be placed in the 5 distinct region, where the grid layout you can mention as many components as you can place there, but in the form of a grid. So, usually grid is basically having the number of rows and column specification m cross n. And now, in this example as we see, we create a grid layout of size 3 cos 3. So, that means total 9 is a example of 9 grids. There we can mention so 1 to 9 buttons are there, okay, and they can be followed according to the grid layout pattern, and then they will be automatically from order, the order they have mentioned in this, or the order which we have added into the frame actually, in the same order it will place it. Okay, as we see here, this is the display little bit bigger in size. So, I am just resizing by using the mouse zooming here. Okay, right. Okay, so, we can see it here that the different buttons, see in this case 9 buttons are arranged into the grid layout pattern following the grid layout manager. Our next example is card layout. So, this is the last layout managers in the example. So, card layout means it is basically 3, I mean you can add here in this example as we see 5 cards have been added, and all these cards can be clicked, so that the next card can be popped. In this example as we see the layout dot next has been, that means if we click the mouse then the next card will be popped, and okay. So, this is right here. Now, let us see example about it. We have actually each card in this case includes one full button actually. So, little bit bigger in size, yeah, okay, fine. So, this is the one card. Now, if we click on any portion here, then the next card will be displayed here. As you see the next card, then you can click it, next card. So, the different cards are there and again go on. So, okay, so then fine. right. So, cards there is the 5, after the fifth card is displayed, if we again click on, so card 1 will be there. Okay. So, if it is the next means in the order they have added, according to that order card will be there. Instead of next, if we say previous, you can see the different result you can obtain. So, instead of next you write previous. So, layout dot previous this. Okay. So, in the layout manager we can define next, previous, yeah, exactly. Okay. So, it is now created, and if it is previous means card 1, after this it will go to the card 5 and then card 5, then card 4 and so on. So, this basically gives an idea about how the different card can be played actually. And now it is basically card means you, on clicking the different frame will be popped up, and then this will give an output like this. So, we have discussed although the different components individually, but actually in an application all the many components can be included in one application in an applet like this one, then the whole thing, see, for example, in a calculator. So, there may be text field, some label, some other buttons and other checkbooks, and everything can be included and they can be added there, and this way you can do it. And finally, the manager, so layout management, it basically helps a program automatically fixing in which way all the component can be managed. We have discussed about the flow layout manager, border layout manager, grid layout manager, and then card layout manager. All these managers, I mean classes, they are defined in AWT package, as you have already discussed in theory, and all the components are also discussed, they are really defined in the java.awt.component class. So, they are basically all button, label, they are the subclass of the component class, and we can add it, we can add them either into an applet or we can add them into an frame. So, we have already discussed about how a particular component can be added, how a number of components can be added either into a frame or into an applet, how the components can be added into either frame and applet using say layout manager, border, card, flow or grid layout manager like. So, that is all okay. This is basically illustration about the AWT, and our next part that we have to discuss about event handling, because we are referring the event handling concept many times. Now, we will discuss event handling, that will be our next module actually. Thank you very much.